Good evening, and I'm really delighted to be back here. As colleagues said, it was in this hall, but downstairs that we had our consultation meeting when I was over in Jersey before, and I get asked to write a lot of reports about SEN and make recommendations, and it's rather, I will share the 51 with you later, don't worry, you know. And some of them go a long way, some of them quite often, especially when you're advising individual bits of the system, go nowhere at all. So it's just fantastic to come back here and see that within relatively short period of time, there's now a Parent Carers Forum, and I think a real commitment, therefore, to actually start embedding parental views into the whole system. So it's just really fantastic. So it's really exciting for me to come back to Jersey and then kind of celebrate that and hopefully help just kind of provoke you a bit on your journey in terms of what that might look like and what good practice might look like around all of this. So I want to do three things. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got here in terms of parental engagement and some of the theory behind it and why it's a good thing to do. Then I'm going to do some practical stuff in terms of, well, what might that look like? And I'm actually going to try and give you some stuff to go away with so you can start doing this. And then we're going to just do a little bit more at the end about some of the broader practical things, some of the stuff around kind of systems and school systems and early years systems and how you could kind of integrate that into what you're doing. So that's the kind of roadmap for tonight. I've only got 105 slides, so kind of relax into this. No, a few less than that. Okay, so this actually started for me, even though I was asked to look into why parents haven't got confidence in the SEN system in the English context. Why do I care about whether parents got confidence at all? Does that matter? You're educators. So what have parents got to do with all of this? And the key thing is outcomes and better outcomes. And how do we get better outcomes for children with SEN and disability? And that's what really drove my inquiry, rather than just do we have good parental engagement? Not least because that's what parents really want for their children, obviously. The best possible outcomes their children can have. So how do you get that? And the whole thing's a bit like these two mad professors at a blackboard, really. And there's lots of theories, lots of interventions, but then everybody's looking for, what's the next intervention? What's the great big thing that's going to get us there? And so often that's the bit where you're looking for the miracle to happen in all the different kind of philosophies, approaches, things that we do to make it happen. And for me, and what I'm going to try and convince you of tonight, is the bit where the miracle happens in all of this isn't often, I'm not saying interventions aren't important, not thinking about what good practice is isn't important, but for me the miracle happens when we also get really good parental engagement. And so that was kind of my starting point for my inquiry. And also, so I should have said right at the beginning, in everything I say, if there's anything negative about the system, I'm probably not talking about Jersey because I don't know enough about it. I'm certainly not talking about all of you in your room. You're all here tonight, you're on the side of the angels. You've given up your evening to come and learn about good practice and make yourselves all better. So if there's anything negative about anything in the system, it's all the people that aren't here tonight, okay? You're already on the side of the angels, so this isn't about you. But when I did look at the system, and I'm sure some of this would apply to Jersey as well, joking aside, what I found was institutionally, we actually know that education achievement for children with SEN is too low. And the gap with their peers is too wide. And it's a hangover from a whole system and a society which did not place enough value on achieving good outcomes for disabled children and children with SEN. And that was my starting point. And I was shocked to find that was still the case, even in 2008. I thought we'd got further. And that's not to say I didn't see some brilliant practice as I went around the country. And in fact, all those 51 recommendations in the report were all from what the best were already doing. It wasn't me. I didn't discover the Higgs boson of education. Okay, everything I recommended was already there. There were already good people doing it. And that was part of the frustration. How was it that we could have a system where people knew what to do, they knew what good practice was, they knew what worked, and actually we weren't actually delivering that? And that was kind of my starting point in the report. How could we still have a system where I could go in and have professionals say to me, well, what can you do with children like these? And that's a real example. And we got it over and over again. And how do we shift that? How much legislation do you need? How much do you need to change the culture to make that happen? And the other big thing that struck us was that nobody had had that discussion with parents about what were their aspirations for their children. What did parents understand by good outcomes, and how could we actually get there? And so all those 51 recommendations, which I'm obviously not going to share with you tonight, really came down to this one thing, that we could have a clear focus on changing the culture of provision, and you did that by focusing on better outcomes, and part of that was about focusing on better parental engagement. And if you could put those two things together, that was what was going to deliver success in the system. Why do I say that? That's the next bit. And again, most of the evidence I'm going to present to you tonight, there's been lots more work done since, was actually there before my inquiry. We knew this in the system. It was about how you brought this together and applied it in a way that people within early years settings, within schools, could actually kind of deliver this better. So this is the kind of science bit, okay? So stick with me on this. I promise it won't last too long. But in 2003, somebody called Charles Deforge, professor, I think Exeter at the time, was asked by the government to look at all the evidence across the world of what made good parental engagement, and actually kind of summarise that and tell the world what that looked like. And he came up with something really, really interesting, and I'll show you the science behind it in a minute, but just the conclusion. And he said that basically there's robust causal evidence that the impact of parental involvement on their child's learning and attainment, parental involvement has a positive effect on children's achievement, even when the influence of background and factors such as social class and family have been taken into account. So basically what he's saying, if you take the poorest child in Jersey today in the most impoverished circumstances, but they have good parental engagement, they will do better than other impoverished children. Take the most privileged child you can think of in Jersey today from the most privileged family, and what will still make a difference, no matter how good the education is, how much they paid for, how many extra tutors they have, if the parental engagement is good, they will do better than others of their peers. And this is really quite fundamental, because what it says is, irrespective of any other brilliant thing you as educators do, those children that also have really good parental engagement will do better, will have better outcomes on any measure. I'm not talking about academic attainment, I'm talking about progression, I'm talking about wider outcomes. It doesn't matter what it is, that's what will happen for those children. Government was so amazed about these conclusions, they got a guy called Harris to review it all again in 2006. Came up with exactly the same result. Empirical evidence shows parental involvement is one of the key factors in securing higher student achievement and sustained school performance. And we know that all starts in the early years, and what happens in the early years that leads on to that. So if your provision in the early years, if you're a school, and if you want to actually achieve better outcomes for your children, you have to take parental confidence seriously. As well as 51 recommendations, I've got about 3 whole A4 type sides of references about all of this, if anybody wants them and is unbelieving. But just a couple more on this. Wadfogel and Washbrook. Studies have indicated that parenting style can account for 19% of the gap in mathematics, 21% in literacy, 33% in language. So actually it's measurable. The gap is measurable in terms of, by parenting style, they mean parents that are really engaged with their children will produce those kind of results above and beyond what would happen otherwise. So how I was able to convince government that actually we wanted to look at parental engagement wasn't just because it was kind of flavour of the month, it's the nice thing to do, oh, parental engagement, it's kind of nice, happy, clappy thing to think about. It's because actually there is really hard-edged academic evidence that whatever programs you work with, what other interventions you have, if you don't have really good parental engagement, you're not really calling on all the resources you have as professionals at your fingertips to actually produce those better outcomes. Early years ones, you will all know as early years practitioners, but I put it up anyway just to make sure you're seeing the evidence around that. At school entry, age 5, attending preschool improved children's academic and social outcomes with an early start before 3. Attending high quality setting being particularly beneficial. And as part of that is not just the early years setting, but how parents are engaged in all of that, which was found by this. So again, there's a whole raft of studies. You've got some of them in your pack. Hoff, it's just one very classic one around all of this, shows that the differences between affluent and disadvantaged children's language ability at 2 years of age can be explained almost entirely in terms of the differences in complexity and diversity of speech those children hear from their mothers. So the effect of mothers on their children's language acquisition, and the more mothers are involved with children around that language acquisition, the greater their actual capacity around language will be when they start school. Therefore, the better outcomes they're going to have, the more they're going to advance, and the quicker they're going to advance around all of that. And so, we know it's fundamentally also true for the early years around things like language acquisition. I'll show you some more research later around this that shows the specific effect of parental engagement on this as well. But, that's just one fundamental study around the language acquisition bit. So I said I'd tell you the science. Before we go into this, anyone here teach maths? Brilliant, I'm safe. I'm now going to explain to you standard deviation, okay, and then you'll understand this chart. Standard deviation is very, very simple. All you need to know about it is a very small move away from the average and the norm is a very big effect in standard deviation. So when you look at this, and you look at pupil age 7, and what Deforge did was he looked at all the studies, and then he put them through this very sophisticated mathematical process that looks at, and this is how he could say what he said, because he discounted all the different things by looking at standard deviations against social class, against all the different things, and this is what stood out, parents. So at age 7, the parental effects on development and achievement is 0.29. The school effects is 0.05. So sorry for anyone that's a primary school teacher like my younger daughter. Parents have a massively bigger effect on the achievement and the outcomes of the children, what's actually happening at school. By about 11, it's almost equaled out, 0.27, 0.21. The parental effect is still slightly greater. And as any parent in this room knows, by the time you get to teenagers, they're not listening to you at all. And that's shown here. 16, parental effect, 0.14. School effects massively taken over, 0.51. They're not listening to you anymore, but they are now listening to the school. I know it's not quite as simple as that, but essentially what Deforge was showing very scientifically is that the parental effect in the early years is bigger than any of the interventions that the schools are doing. So not to include parents, not to have that parental engagement at that point is fundamental in terms of whether you're going to achieve those better outcomes. And if you want to take this back to your setting and say, we've got to spend far more time with parents, someone says, oh God, why? We've got enough to do. We're educators. We don't deal with the parents. If you do nothing else, explain standard deviation to them and then put this in front of them, okay? It's science. They can't argue with it. What works best in terms of that? So what types of? Because what Deforge said was in terms of homeschool engagement. That's the key. Really good homeschool engagement is the thing that makes a difference. Parents helping children to read, effect size 0.18. That's already big as a standard deviation. Parents help children listen to read 0.51. That's massive in terms of a standard. So that's a really big thing you can do. Parents help teach specific reading skills 1.15. That's off the scale in terms of a standard. Standard deviations hardly get to the 0.5 bit. So 1.15 is massive. It's a massive effect. Teaching specific reading skills. But what Deforge said, it's all to do with homeschool engagement, and I'm going to talk about what that looks like and how that kind of happens in a bit more detail in a minute. So that's part of the context that allowed me in the recommendations I made to government to look at saying, actually, we've got to legislate, we've got to say that you've got to include parents in what you do, not because it's a nice thing to have, but if you're an educator and you believe in achieving those better outcomes, it's a fundamentally essential thing to have as part of all of that. What was the background to that, and why was I saying that actually there was still a fundamental problem in the system in terms of outcomes and parental confidence? Well, I won't show you the figures I did at the time, and these are English figures, not other ones, but I'll show you where we are now. And so this is, oh my God, 10 years on from when I actually started doing my inquiry. Those are the English figures for last year. And the only thing you need to worry about that is the one right on your far right. The biggest attainment gap, certainly in England, I'd be surprised if it was very different over here, but I don't know the Jersey figures. The biggest attainment gap in England is still for children with SEN. So 10 years since I did my report, 8 years since people started talking about changing the legislation, 4 years since it's been in, and we are still not achieving significantly in terms of closing that gap. Now, I know children in SEN may not meet floor standards, but we ought to be at least ensuring that all children with SEN and disability are progressing, and progressing well against whatever their capabilities are. And we're not doing that within the system as well, because this is children reaching expected standard in reading, writing and maths for different groups. So we're not talking here just about floor standards, we're just talking about expected standards in terms of reading, writing and maths. So you can guess which children aren't going to go on and meet the floor standards on the basis of that. That gap need not be that big, and if anybody doubts that, I'll show you something later that actually proves that. So worse than any other disadvantaged group, we're still there. So it's not surprised when you come, in England they do a parental survey each year, parental's confidence, in different bits of the system. So even with all the stuff we've done in the last 4-6 years in England to try and improve parental confidence about SEN, how well parents and carers and pupils feel teachers and other school staff are preparing them for adult life. With SEN 66%, without SEN 70%. Parents and carers, pupils 54 versus 66. So even pupils with SEN don't feel they're being prepared as well in life, and they notice it at school. It's fundamental. Parents notice it, parents and carers notice it across the board. Again, happiness with progress in school, massive difference. So parents are rightly perceiving, because we've got the other evidence, that children with SEN are not progressing as well as children without SEN. So the idea that parents don't care about their children's outcomes, don't notice it, isn't true. And of course that all starts in the early years, as I needn't tell you. If we don't get the early years provision right, then by the time they get to school, this is the picture you start to see. Pupils notice it. So the idea that pupils aren't aware of what's happening to them, they're not happy with their own progress at school. They can see they could be doing more if they were given the right support to be able to do all that. So it's no wonder in the system people are still feeling like a poor little girl here, bad headache. And that's why we need the parental engagement, because it's very easy to feel complacent, but we're nowhere near actually landing this in terms of outcomes. We may have improved policy, process, procedure around this, but we haven't done it yet in terms of where we're going to get to. So if that's the kind of picture, if that's where we are, if we actually know that if we can engage parents properly around all of this, we can make it work, what is it parents say they actually want? Again, I could present some of the stuff out of my own inquiry, but there's some newer stuff that says very much the same kind of things. We did a very big survey, 3,000 parents, when I did my inquiry, in-depth interviews with 250. This is more recent from a look at what's going to happen. But just first, so what we did in England is what I recommended was integrated into the legislation and then the code of practice. I'm really delighted to see, I don't know how many of you have seen the New Jersey Code of Practice, but has now been integrated into the Jersey SEN Code of Practice. And this is the core bit, and in the English legislation, this is actually written into the legislation and is then in the Code of Practice. So this is section 19 in the English legislation, and you've adopted it. I haven't just completely killed the thing now by saying that this was in England and not invented in Jersey. And fundamentally, what you will see is that it embeds that understanding of what's happening in the school system. So the education department and schools must, in relation to children, young people, and have regards to the views, wishes and feelings of child, young person, their parent or carer, the importance of the child, young person, their parents and carers, participating as fully as possible in decisions and being provided with the information and support necessary to enable participation in those decisions, and the need to support the child, young person, their parents and carers in order to facilitate the development of children and young people and help them achieve the best possible education and other outcomes, preparing them effectively for adulthood. And so you see fundamentally the link I was talking about between the parental engagement and the achievement of better outcomes. And that's now going to be the requirement in the Jersey education system. And there's the bit where it says this applies to early years, nursery education. So it applies to all of you guys in the room as well. And therefore, that's fundamentally the context in which you're now being required to deliver as well. And I have to say, certainly within the English context, this has had a fundamental effect in driving forward the whole kind of conversation around how parents are engaged in this. Not just because it says parents have got to be engaged and children and their views and wishes taken into account at all stages, but because it's actually fundamentally linked that through to outcomes. And you can see the way that's kind of, certainly in the English system, then started to run through the whole system, such that, I know you've got a different inspection system here, but Ofsted in England now look when they inspect schools to see how well outcomes for children with SEN have actually been delivered and how well parents have been engaged in those outcomes. So I hope your inspection system in a similar way will start to look at how for early years provision and at schools, the same thing happens in terms of running through with all of this. And so fundamentally that system in terms of the legislative expectations around that are in place. But actually I wouldn't want to rely on those. I mean, the rather ironic thing, the biggest thing my report got a lot of flack for was I didn't recommend more legislation. That I didn't try and nail people to the floor with a whole set of prescriptions about exactly how they're supposed to do this stuff. And I didn't do that because at the end of the day I believe this is about hearts as much as it is about minds. So you've got to have the evidence there. But actually I don't think people will do this just because you prescribe they do it in a code of practice. Important as that is, I think actually then you've got to understand why you're doing it and want to live that to make it happen. So actually you're going to do it because it's going to produce those better outcomes, not because somebody's giving you a list of stuff to do in a set of guidance. I think the guidance is important in nudging you in the right and the system in the right direction, and certainly so you can take back to people within your service and say, this is what we've got to do now, so let's get on and do it. But I don't want anybody doing it because somebody's written a rule book with a list in it and somebody wants to tick a set of boxes. This is about actually people believing it's the right thing to do. And so within that, if that's what you've got to do, listen to the views and wishes of parents to deliver those better outcomes, what do those parents want? As I said, I did a very big piece of research in terms of my inquiry, but here's some newer stuff. It came to very much the same conclusion. So this was a review of dispute resolution procedures. So this is where parents have been through the system in England and not been very happy with the outcomes and have gone to dispute resolution. And so when they did a review of that, they asked parents, well, what were the things that went wrong that we'd like to have been done differently? And they're very similar answers to the 3,000-person study that we did in terms of what parents want. And it's really simple stuff at the end of the day, and this is one of my key points. Again, this isn't massively complicated in terms of what parental expectations are. When I did my inquiry, we said, well, you can't really ask parents what they want because they're just going to ask for the Rolls-Royce service all the time. They're going to want for huge things that the system can't deliver. And I think that perception came about because if the system doesn't deliver, if parents have to fight all the time, yes, you do end up in a situation where you get parents that do become, the term in English is warrior parents, I think we kind of use over here, that actually are at war with the system. As you've heard from the parent council, well, that's not where parents actually want to be. They only end up there when nobody listens to them in the whole system. And if you get that bit right, you're going to save yourself acres of time without not having the warrior parents, but the parents that are on your side trying to do the same things. And they wanted some really simple things. Have their children's needs recognised and met so the young person has as good a chance as possible of a fulfilling life. Recognised and met, not necessarily the Rolls-Royce service, just recognise what I'm telling you about my child and listen to what I'm saying, and we'll have a conversation about it. Good communication with professionals and workers dealing with their child's case. To be listened to and have their views taken on board, or at least be respectfully included in the discussion. So I might not always be right, but please listen to me and make me part of that conversation about what you do. To have staff that really understand SEN, fundamentally important. I've got to be confident as a parent that you actually understand my child and know what you're talking about. Or if not, you can go and find someone that does, because otherwise I'm going to lose confidence in the system, and that's when I go back to being a warrior parent. Empathy from my lived experience. So again, understand what my life is like when I'm bringing my child to you. Fundamentally important. I can't say how many parents groups I'm going to talk to where parents have just said, I wouldn't be here if someone had just shown some empathy and some understanding about my child and listened to what I was saying. And we could have had a conversation. I might not have got everything I wanted, but we could have had a conversation about that. And I know from when I did the survey over here before, and we saw the surveys then about Jersey parents, what they're saying exactly the same thing. So I can say with confidence about this one, it's exactly what Jersey parents were saying as well. And get that right, and you're really onto a winner. So how as professionals do you do that? What is it you're supposed to be doing in all of this? If that's what parents want, what do you need to be doing? And again, my kind of message is, it's maybe a lot kind of simpler than you think. A lot of what the system does, and again, I know you're all on the side of the angels, so you're not going to be doing any of this. You're already there, I know. But what the system does, I think one of the reasons why this comes about is it tells early years professionals, it tells teachers, it tells other people working in the system that basically they're the professionals and they're the experts. And therefore been trained in all these interventions, know all this theory about how to do stuff. And therefore they need to be in control of the situation, they need to be managing the parental input, managing the child, managing what's happening, and making decisions. And then the role of the professional is then to inform parents about that. And what parents are supposed to be doing is providing information and the expert support and guides them around that. And that's one of the reasons, apart from all the other things like not enough resources, the culture and all the rest of it, why I think we've ended up where we are, because actually that's a very disempowering model, I would argue, for the professional who always has to be in that controlling spot, and the parent that's always the one that's having it delivered. And if any of you doubt that, I don't know what parents' evenings are like in Jersey, but you know, how many of you have been through a parents' evening where you get told to come in, sit down, somebody goes through a list of things, and now have you got any questions? Right, thank you very much, next one. And so you probably will all know, as parents, if you've been through a parents' evening, what that model feels like, because that's that model. That's what you do. You manage parents, get them in, get them out. School runs efficiently fine. My first job ever was as a librarian, and we just thought libraries would run perfectly if we didn't have borrowers. They mess the shelves up, they put all the books in the wrong place, they don't know what they're doing, they mess the system up. I'm not saying schools and early services like that, obviously. Again, this isn't new. I even referenced it because actually this is a theory from 1991, and it was developed in relation to parent partnership in child development centres and childcare. So early years, it was early years practitioners that developed this model, which is why now I'm on a winner here, because you're probably already working like this already and wondering, why did I come after all? And what it looks at is a model where the professional is a facilitator and facilitates the system, where they're commissioning support from all sorts of different places. Where you are an expert, absolutely, and I'm not saying there isn't a role for professionalism, don't mishear me. There absolutely is a role for good professionalism and good professionals. You do need to know about those interventions. But you're also looking for partners to do that with. You're providing advice and expertise where necessary. And you're recognising that a parent comes with their own skills, their own resources, and their own abilities, that they come with a social network that you can help to support them. That as a parent, they understand their child. They may not understand in the expert way that you do, but they know what happens at home. They know how their child gets anxious. They know what calms them down. They know what they're interested in. And that's an amazing resource for you as professionals to work with. They have those individual strengths and resources and needs about all of that. Under the current system, at least in the UK, they're now also a consumer. They can have an individual budget for short breaks. They can have an individual budget for education. They can actually be a commissioner of those services themselves. And they can also understand and help and support and define strategies and outcomes for you to work with. One very little example of that I'll kind of give you from the work we did with Achievement for All. I haven't got time for longer ones, and there's lots of them. You had a parent working with the school that we were working with, and nothing was working for their child who had autism. And they sat down and they had parental conversation I'm going to talk about in a minute, and actually discovered through the parent talking, well, what happens at home? What do you do at home? He follows me around everywhere. Well, where do you go? Oh, I do a lot of gardening. He loves gardening. He loves being out in the garden. Follows me around, helps me with all of that. So one time he's really kind of calm when he's at home and we do stuff. School thought, right, it's gardening that gets this little boy really interested. They rearranged every example, the whole curriculum, around gardening examples. How many pots, how many plants, how many seeds. Suddenly, they had him. It's a very simple example. It's like, well, that can't be rocket science. No. Very simple insights into what was happening that allowed the professionals to use their professional experience to work through how they might alter the curriculum. Once they made the breakthrough, they could go on and do other things. But just that one insight from understanding what was happening at home, what the parents understood about their child, makes incredible difference. And so the ladder of engagement bit of co-production, this is another way of thinking about it on the individual level in terms of the way you're working with parents. Parents bring that knowledge and expertise, their own resources, networks and support for the approach of the setting of the school. Practitioners bring their knowledge and expertise, accessing additional support, bringing the whole power of that service and other things you can call on to actually work together in the best interests of getting those kind of parental outcomes. And that's really what we should be aiming for in the system in terms of making it work. So when you have that kind of very trendy term of kind of co-production at the individual level, I think it works as well in seeing each other as partners in delivering those better outcomes for the children. So that's all very great, Brian. It's all kind of a load of theory and a lot of claims, but how do we do it? What I want to do with the next bit is take a deep breath, park all the kind of theory stuff and the legislation and models of professional practice. I'm going to share with you something that kind of, some of you may have heard it, some may think you're doing it, you just never called it that. What's called structured conversation, which was a very specific methodology that was developed. Again, was already around, that we developed as part of a particular pilot program that came out of my inquiry called Achievement for All. It's a 2-year program, 450 schools, massive evaluation by Manchester University of different elements that I was recommending, and I'll come back to what all those are at the end of the talk. But a fundamentally key one was the parental engagement bit and how at an individual level, professionals engage in a conversation with parents and what that looks like. And I'm going to give you the gist of that. You can Google it and you'll find lots more in terms of resources around it. But I'm going to give you the basic structure of that today and how you could kind of actually do that. And some of you just go, yeah, I do all this already, in which case, great. But essentially, and this was kind of modelled and brought together as a kind of intervention. It's got a lot of psychological insight behind it in terms of how you can make it work in a very sophisticated way. But basically what it says is the framework for structured conversation is having a much more open conversation with parents over a longer period of time than you would get in a parent evening. And so you're looking at a conversation of 30 to 45 minutes, ideally at least once a term, where you sit down with the parent at the beginning of the term, and what you say is basically, let's look at your child, let's look at what we're trying to do with your child, and explore what the issues are. Lots of open-ended questions asking the parent, well, what do you think is happening at the moment? What do you think your child's needs are? What really interests them? And then sharing with that parent your insights as a professional about what you think is going on in that situation as well, once you've started to understand what's going on with the child and with that family. And then starting to focus and say, well, actually, what do we need to do here then? What are the joint outcomes that we are going to agree that we're going to be working on this term with your child? What are the kind of targets, what that might look like, and identifying the kind of key issues that you want to work on. And then plan, actually agreeing those targets together, agreeing what those outcomes are and developing an action plan. And as you'll know, both in the English legislation here, there's a duty to actually produce a plan. Whether you have a statutory plan or not, certainly in the English legislation, it's a very clear duty that every child should have a plan. A plan could be half a page. Needn't be complicated. It can be very simple. Then as you start to work through that plan, you add to it. It's very much the same as like the personal profile in the early years setting. You have the personal profile, you look at that, and you start to plan. And you agree what those outcomes are. The whole crucial thing is you do it together. It's not the professionals going off in a room, having the review about the child, writing them down, and then just saying to the parent, this is what we're doing. The parent is part of that process. As you get older, the young person can become part of that process as well. And in kind of person-based planning, that's certainly what you see a lot of as you go up the age range. The young person will be involved in a lot of that planning as well. Then you go and do it. And you see how well it works. But you don't wait till next year to come back and then see how well that's gone. It's constantly reviewed. And certainly at the start of the next term, at the latest, you come back and you see how it's being. But within that, as the parent's coming in, you're sharing what's happening. You're sharing what you're doing, that good homeschool working bit again, and seeing whether it's working. You're adjusting the plan, and then you review. So you come back at that next meeting. Well, how's it been going for you? So you go back to the explore stage. How has it been going with you? What's happening? What else do we need to do? If you haven't already adjusted it before then. And certainly if you're familiar with the English Code of Practice and Chapter 6 and 5 and 6, which is the early years in the schools, there's this whole process of assess, plan, do, review. And that was essentially based on the extrapolation of what was in the structured conversation. Explore, focus, plan, review. It's not quite the same words, but essentially it's the same process. Assess, plan, do, review. So explore, focus, do the plan, review it, start again. Ideally at least once a term, more often if things aren't working and you need to come back and do all of that. And that, in a nutshell, is the structured conversation. Some things around it, it's about making parents feel comfortable in all that. It's not about saying, well, we see parents between these hours. It's actually about arranging meetings at times that are convenient for parents. If necessary, so I know someone's already thinking, what about the difficult to reach parents? What about the ones that don't want to come into the provision? The ones that send nanny, never turn up themselves? A lot of the work we've done with Achievement for All, whether it's been with early years settings, schools, or otherwise, is going out and doing outreach to reach those parents. I know a lot of you say, well, you haven't got time for that. Just ask you to think how much time you might waste on interventions, on behaviour management, on other issues around children by not getting that relationship right and really understanding what's going on with the child, and then set that against how much time investing in this might actually deliver better results for you around that. All I can say is in schools and early years settings where we've done Achievement for All and done the structured conversation, no one would go back. No one would go back on spending that amount of time with each individual parent doing that. Certainly for the SEN children, quite a few of the primary schools we've done it in, now they've abolished parents' evening. They just have a structured conversation for every parent. They either get the TAs to take the classes or they buy some extra resource in to free up the teachers to do that, because the impact is so profound on those parental relationships with the school or the early years setting, what they can do after that in terms of having that parent as a resource that's working with them on the whole programme. And I've got at least a couple of people sitting in the audience tonight that will be able to testify to that, from they've been through it all with us. You agree the length of the time of the meeting. You ensure that parents have all the information they need before they get in there, so actually they can prepare, they understand as well. Obviously that means about thinking about how you transmit that information to parents. And in the meeting, the big thing professionals are not going to do is just sort of leap straight in and go, well, I think what's going on with your child is, it's about open-ended questions. It's about saying, what do you think is happening? What do you think is going on with your child at the moment? And things like this. So, outcomes. If a miracle occurred overnight, how would you know? As in, if there was a big change, if you wanted a really big change for your child, what would that look like? Describe that to me. So you're not asking them to be professionals and start giving you all sorts of early years kind of targets for stuff. You're saying, what would good look like from your perspective? What would your child like to do? Well, actually, I'd like them to be able to say a few more words. Actually, I'd like their ability to be better. Actually, I'd like them to be able to do. And often it's very practical things. You say, right, well, let's work on that. And then you start to use your professional skills to say, what would that look like? But so if we had better outcomes, what would have changed? What would my child be able to do that they can't do now? What would somebody else have noticed if there was that success? And put it always into the positive. My child would be able to. Not my child's deficits are that we're going to work on. My child would be able to do. And you focus on those kind of things. And now this is the very reduced Shakespeare guide to say, you know, the whole training booklet is about 90 pages, all the different things you can do. But, you know, you can make a start. Just by doing some of these things, you can make a start in your own provision, very, very simply. There's some broader things people have done in terms of parental engagement. Just use some school examples here because they're a bit easier. But Family Learning Day. So again, the hard to reach parents. We can never get parents into our provision. Put something on after hours that they can stay for. I know a school, a primary school that's dealing with traveller children where they said, you're mad, we're never going to get any of the traveller families in here. They put on after school cooking. So yeah, do you want to come in? We're doing some cooking after school. Do you want to come and do some cooking with your children? Yes, all right then. Discovered that a lot of the parents were only functionally slightly more literate than the children they were trying to do the reading programs with. Notice they're having trouble even reading the cookie books. Do you want some help with that? Do you want to come over here, sit on the sofa? We'll do some literacy work with you. They got a lot of the parents on the same literacy program about 4 weeks in front of where their children were. Amazing. Nobody believed it could happen. You can do this kind of stuff. Back to school evenings, back to early years provision evenings, home visits. Again, I know it's big on time, but again, it can make a fundamental difference if you can kind of see what's happening in the home and have home visits around all of that. Just one case study from the early years and some of the work that Achievement 4 did around the early years provision. Within the early years provision, this one called it, we called it when we were doing some of the early years work, taking time for talk. So we didn't call it structured conversation, which again immediately sounds like very professional intervention. Taking time for talk. And in this one, they discovered through that Kieran loved playing with cars and trains. So those were used as a tool to help him manage his concentration levels, develop his ability to share, play positively with other children. As a result of effective partnerships between the setting and the family, his behaviour has been transformed. Concentration and listening skills went up. Staff noticed that he became more caring towards other younger children. Child fell over, he'd stop and ask them, so on and so on and so on. The preschool manager said at the end, because this was preschool setting we were working with, Kieran's come on leaps and bounds, we're delighted with this progress. The approach we've implemented for him has been consistent at home and in preschool, and he's responded really well. Became much calmer and his behaviours improved dramatically. Again, the investment in that versus trying to manage the behaviour otherwise. I know it sounds like a lot. And the impact on learning, therefore, because he manages behaviour, manages engagement in the setting, accelerated progress across all areas of learning, now age-related expectations, particular progress in managing feelings, behaviour, speaking, and physical development. So, you know, it can be done. Now, this is the bit I really regret thinking of doing, because I'm going to use video. I never use video, because it always goes wrong for me, okay? But I just want to give you sort of a little film about how this works in a live early years setting, so you don't have to listen to me so much.
Wind it back again, wind it back again.
If I can't do much at all, I want them to get the best from me. Yeah, that's what I want to do. I want them to get the very best from me, because if I didn't get that chance, I would like my children to get them. Yeah, so they can't say, Mummy didn't try, I tried. Yeah.
We have lots of parents who come here very confident in helping their children learning. And then we have other parents who tell me that they wish they'd achieved more out of their education. And I think part of our role is to help them to understand that they can break that cycle. And it's about us showing them that they can, they can be a huge influence on their children's learning and achievement.
I don't want them to make my mistake of not learning when I should have done, sort of basically. And see if you can get involved with your children's education and helping them even a little bit more, and you can say, oh, well, yeah, I'm doing my bit, and it makes you feel more involved. You're getting something out of it as well, and sometimes I enjoy it. I mean, I love reading to them.
Making bread, shaping bread.
I read to them a lot, and I teach them 1, 2, 3 and ABC, and to improve their skills, because although they come to nurseries or they go to schools, they still need help from the parents at home. So it's the only way your child is going to get up there, because I don't think parents should just rely on the teachers to just teach their children.
Obviously schools have their role to play. They have a job to do in educating children, but creating that culture of learning in the home has an impact on achievement. It can improve behaviour, it reduces the level of school absence, which has a knock-on effect on achievement, and it can influence the time that children stay in school.
It's very important for parents to be involved with the school, to get to know other parents. Also, it's a good example to your children as well. If you make the effort, 'cause sometimes it's difficult, but to make the effort to be sociable and involved and interested in other children and, of course, other parents at the school your child goes to, will hopefully make them have the same sort of interest in it as well.
Well, we'll see how we get on. See if it gets on right. I can reach a bit higher, but I can't reach that high.
Parental involvement happens on lots of levels, but research shows that the crucial element of it is sharing learning goals for the children, is us talking to the parents about how they're doing and what areas we think that we're going to work on with them. That's particularly true for children with special needs. We have lots of children who we're supporting with feeding and toileting. That's only successful when we use the same strategies here and at home. And for example, a little boy who likes the radio on when he's sitting, that's the only way he'll sit on the toilet. It's very important that we know that, and we've got a radio now in the toilet, so he can make connections. It's about helping children make connections between home and school as well, and that's crucial for all children.
Can we put some food in here?
He went to slide, he went to ride a bicycle, he went in the toilet and washed his hands after. He had apple and banana, he tells me all about it. He makes me very happy.
There's a lot of psychology behind this in terms of the art of asking really open-ended questions of how people feel when someone's really interested in them and asking them what they think rather than being told. That starts to create a whole basis of trust between you and the other person. You have to do that active listening. So there's a lot of very clever kind of psychological stuff behind this, but the basic principle is very, very simple to do. It's just about practicing that art of really active listening and then starting to use your professional skills to intervene and say, okay, so what I'm hearing you say is, so if we took that city, well, what about we looked at? And then applying your professional knowledge to that and bringing your skills to the table as well, while understanding what the other person has done. So if that felt at all useful, go back and do more of it. Practice with a colleague before you actually talk to a parent. But try doing it. It is a kind of just go and do it. Because what you're aiming for is this. I mean, it talks about school, it's just easy to be early years setting. So professional, I need to make changes when the school has agreed. The parent, I need to support my child with their schoolwork. The child, I need to work hard so we can do what we agreed. The aim is, as the teacher was saying there, it's about getting to that shared understanding of what outcomes you as a partnership, co-production if you want to use the word, all kind of driving for as part of that relationship. And I saw a great example of a plan this morning when I visited the setting of Emma. And we're just looking at her working with a little boy within that setting. And a brilliant concept of doing some very simple things that she was then going to share with the parent and set her up with exactly those same things to do at home. So what was being done at school is being mirrored at home. It's very clear outcomes about what was trying to happen with all of that. And that's what I mean. It's not rocket science. It's what you already know. It's just understanding the parent, understanding the interventions, understanding the outcomes you're going, sharing that, and then working together. And that's what Deforge meant at the beginning about good homeschool working or good home early years settings working. It's just about understanding what those joint outcomes are and driving those together. And so just before we end, I want to therefore go back to what some of the evidence of success is around this in more detail. So Achievement for All, we did some Achieving Early pilots where we applied, because the research I talked about earlier had been done in relation to schools, so we did the same, an adapted programme looking at early years, and these were just some of the outcomes from the evaluation of that programme. Speech, language and communication assessment showed from baseline 23% at age-related expectations rose to 69% by the end of the programme. So a massive impact of having those parental conversations. It wasn't the only thing the programme was doing, but that was a key part of making it happen. Again, 23% to 73% on personal, social and emotional assessments. 100% of practitioners reported higher levels of confidence of working with parents as a result. As a result of the pilot programme, this is very relevant for the English situation, so I've got it in there, number of settings involved judged outstanding by Ofsted increased from 2 to 8, and the number of settings judged inadequate fell from 5 to 0. So that's the kind of, there's some other things you have to try and harness that with in terms of that real focus on outcomes, real quality first, practice around all of that. But it's the parental engagement that gives you the insight to all of that. I talked earlier about being able to close that SEN gap and accepting we weren't necessarily going to get all children with SEN to floor standards for obvious reasons, but we can be really ambitious about every child making really good progression when they have SEN. And so I just wanted to share this. This is from the work of Achievement for All with schools in England. And this is just about progression. So it's not about floor standards. It's about how many stages of progression we're making. So it's slightly old currency now because the system's moving away from this. This is when we used to measure that. And the green bars, all you have to understand about this is the green bars were the Achievement for All target groups. So those were the children we were working with SEN, and they made more progression than the non-SEN children nationally at Key Stage 2 and at Key Stage 4. 31% higher at Key Stage 2, 41% higher. So that's progression from starting point, which is what we need to be measuring around this. And so with the parental engagement, with the focus on better outcomes, one of the other things we were doing, which I'll just share with you as a total model at the end, actually we were able to demonstrate, so this is over 100,000 pupils, okay, so very big sample size, this isn't wrong, that we were getting better progression for the children with SEN than the non-SEN children in terms of levels of progression achieved. So it does work, it does make a fundamental difference. What other things work within that? Very quickly, and I'm not going to talk through all of these bullet points. They're there so you can take them away, you can look at them. And this is from a big review that was done of parental engagement in 2011. I've given the reference on the next slide. The key thing, without going through all the bullet points, is that the programs that work best is when whatever program you're using at school, you share that with the parents, they understand it, and can either understand it and support its delivery at home or can actually deliver it at home. The other key thing a lot of this says is about ensuring that parents acknowledge that the problem exists and then gain the knowledge and understanding and skills to actually help manage their child. So this is where you have got a role as a professional in helping them understand what's going on with their child and how they can manage that. And as the teacher said in that clip again, which I love it so much, it's very much about, and that was from one of the schools, one of the early years provision settings that was on that Achieving Early programme. And it's about, as far as possible, bringing them in as an ally in what you're doing within the school setting. And the other thing that works incredibly well around this is targeting children's reading outcomes. Reading and language acquisition works incredibly well in relation to encouraging parents to listen to their children read. We're part of the big kind of campaign every year now about, I think it's 1 million words, 1 million minutes. I forget what it is now. It's all about getting children to read far more with their parents. And I think Education Endowment Fund has just given about 5 million in England to teach parents to sing nursery rhymes to their children. Same exactly the same principle as what works here in terms of all of that. And what they did say, so Goodall and Voris, well, all this comes from, if you're starting to think at the level of the setting now and how the setting works, so the overall management of the setting you're working in, 4 things you have to do to make sure this really works in terms of parental engagement. In terms of parental engagement must be planned for and embedded in the whole setting. So it's not something that just one heroic worker or teacher can do. It's got to be something as a team you all decide to do and make sure you implement. It must be led by the people within that setting as well. Again, if you're going to introduce a whole kind of program of doing this work, it can't be just 1 or 2 people that do it within the setting. It's got to be everyone. And it's got to involve active collaboration with parents. You've got to be proactive about that. You can't just say, well, they don't come to me. You've got to go out and make that work. You've got to make the first approach in terms of all of that. We talk about hard to reach parents. Maybe it's better if we talked about hard to reach settings and hard to reach schools. And if you think about it that way, what do they see me as when they come into my setting? How do they experience this? And I know you're really brilliant at this in the early years setting, so I really feel like I'm probably preaching to the converted. We were talking while you were doing the exercise that nearly all this stuff comes from early years practice. Honestly, a lot of this was actually developed by early years practitioners, so I'm sure you know a lot of all of this. And then you have to sustain it. It's not something you kind of do and then you go away and do all the other stuff and you go back to the interventions. You've got to sustain this all the way through. It's not just if you're thinking, well, is this just the UK? Are we peculiar in some way? Are we all different? They're doing exactly the same in the States. They're doing exactly the same in lots of other countries, but I just thought I'd give you the States because they've done a lot of good research on it over there as well. And exactly the same thing, slightly different language, but this is Henderson, Matley Johnson, research in the States, personal relationships and mutual understandings with families, informal one-to-one conversations sounds very much like the structured conversation to me, sharing data with families about, so that's all about the outcomes, modelling high-impact teaching practice, listening to families' ideas about their children's interests and challenges, and using input to differentiate and structure. So sorry, the language is all a bit professional, but it's saying exactly the same thing. So I just want incorporating content from families' home cultures into classroom lessons. So it's two-way. It's two-way around all of that. And so, again, in terms of system thinking, how does that parental engagement fit with the other elements of how you produce better outcomes? So it's about leadership within the setting. It's about ensuring that you have got the best quality, high quality teaching and learning going on in your setting. So it is about your professionalism, it is about your knowledge, it is about your knowledge of interventions, but it's then harnessing that with parental engagement. So that's the bit, those 2 bits on that side of the quadrant is outcomes plus parental engagement. So the real focus on outcomes, high quality teaching and learning with the parental engagement. And then the wider outcomes, what else is it that excites those children and those parents? What else is it they're really good at that you can bring into the classroom and make work when you've done all of that? So that's almost my last slide. And I think, yes, 1 more minute. I'm even almost on time. But as I said, I'm very aware, talking to you as an audience, that you're only here tonight because you had a passion for all of this. I'm sure a lot of you have been looking at this, and even if you didn't call it by those names, you've been doing whole elements of this practice because you're really good early years practitioners. What I'd really hope you just take away from tonight is there are really good reasons to invest in this in your practice, in your provision, make it something your whole provision does, not because the New Jersey Code of Practice requires it, but it's great that it does. And, there is that as a kind of good driver for all of that. But actually because you know and believe that this is the really right thing to do, because you're all in this room tonight, because you want to achieve better outcomes for the young children you're looking after. And also, I'm here talking about children with SEN. As that teacher said, it's all children. This doesn't just work for children with SEN. If you do all this really well within your setting, all your children in your setting will do better to the extent that you engage them, and your parents and all of that. So whatever you've heard that's convinced you tonight or not, I want you to go away and, dear optimist, pessimist, realist, while you guys were busy arguing about the cost of water jankets, sincerely the opportunist, you can argue to the cows come home about the pieces of evidence, the interventions. This is a kind of just go out there and do it, because, you know, the prize is really big if you get this right. Thank you very much for listening to me, and very happy to take any general questions you've got about this, and then we've got a few structured ones. But you've been very patient for a whole hour, and thank you very much, and good luck with your practice and what you're doing.